So very glad we can have this session today, this webinar on the topic of portfolio management, a topic that we're actively working on. So very glad to be able to share some of our findings, with working with customers, some of the approaches we have taken with different customers, also some lessons learned, and also be able to kind of capture some Q&A at the end of today's session. So today, portfolio power play, how to cut costs, how to maximize gains in that. We're very happy to also do this together with Bram Smet, our CEO. So welcome, Bram, also to this webinar. Maybe before we dive into the content and how we see portfolio management fitting into the broader scheme of enterprise planning, and especially the link to sales and operations planning and supply chain planning, a bit running over today's agenda and what do we see being covered in today's session. As indicated, Bram will give us the context around, okay, what is the role of portfolio management in the broader context of sales and operations planning and enterprise planning? How does he see that? How does he see companies struggling on that? And what is the role portfolio management can play in that domain? I will then share a number of learnings from our research and working with customers. Why is it so hard? What is difficult in that portfolio management domain? And what are we trying to do to address that from a combination of people, process, tooling, and analytics perspective? We will touch upon winning portfolios, what we see as winning portfolios, also how it links to the organizational structure. Where does it fit within the organization, that topic of portfolio management? We will link it to a portfolio ladder and different types of portfolio actions. We'll talk about cost of complexity. How do you create rules of the game before starting the exercise? How do you make it into a process rather than a project? And also, how can it be well supported and also digitized in these times of really having the processes that are well supported with digital solutions in order to really have efficient processes, as well as from a data support perspective. And we'll try to give a number of takeaways from this webinar in the summary at the very end. So a lot of material to cover today. So for sure, in the next 45 minutes, we'll have plenty of topics to exchange and to talk about. We have a Q&A panel or chat room. Don't hesitate to leave some questions. We'll be happy to take them at the end of today's webinar. So, Bram, as said, can you give us your perspective on how it fits into that broader S&OP process and challenge?
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure, Nick. So people who know us may know that we come from the S&OP space, and S&OP is all about balancing sales and operations. So it's about that demand review and that supply review and having the right inventories in between. It's the bottom of the chart that you see here. But there's a couple of more tactical strategic questions like customer product segmentation, product management review, which we see less covered in companies. But where we believe that there's a lot of value. Customer product segmentation, what we see there is that a lot of companies use the same service level for all customers and all products. And just by saying that, you understand that cannot never be the optimal solutions. No two customers are equal because they don't have the same volume, they don't have the same margin, they don't have the same loyalty, they don't have the same willingness to innovate. And from a product perspective, no two products are equal. Some products more reflect the past, others more reflect the future. Some of them are very easy for you to produce, and others are really a pain in the neck. And segmenting customers and products is key to optimize your S&OP. If I make the link to demand planning, I often say, once you know who the A customers are, then stop guessing what these customers will buy from you. If these are truly A customers, start to do collaborative forecasting and planning with them. In the supply planning, Even yesterday, I had a discussion with a customer where we say in our NPS, if there's a constraint in capacity, raw materials, how can we prioritize? Well, here again, our customer product segmentation may steer the prioritization in our supply planning or our allocation methods. Then we have product management review, where our finding is throughout the years that companies are very good at introducing new stuff, but very bad at taking old stuff out. And at the center of that vision, you see that supply chain triangle. So Nick will come back to that. When we try to solve and optimize the portfolio, we start from the triangle. So it's not just about service or sales, but it's also what are the costs that we make. So what are the margins? And it's not just about the margin, it's also about how much cash or capital employed do we need to realize those margins? So what's the working capital? How do we utilize our assets? So when we solve that portfolio management question, we link back into the triangle. What we noticed is that the bottom part, demand, inventory, supply, is often covered in standard advanced planning systems, but the product portfolio management is not covered, neither in planning systems, neither in financial planning systems. So that's why we have built our own solution. And what Nick will take us through is that on the one hand, you need tools to manage today's complexity, but it's also about what are the processes around that? How do we educate the organization on how to drive better portfolio decisions? And so it's always about process, tools, people, and analytics. And if you want to know more about that base S&OP vision, as I would call it, there's the QR code at the bottom right. So if you scan it, you will be able to get more info on our standard S&OP vision, where that portfolio management clearly fits in, I would say, both on the customer product segmentation and the product management review. So that is a small intro. Nick, I'm happy to give the word back to you.
Thank you. Let's talk about the current challenges around product portfolio management. What are the challenges companies currently face in that domain? And what we see is in majority of companies, the product portfolio analysis is a one-off exercise. It's actually an exercise that is done when the profitability has really eroded strongly, and there is a need for a significant transformation. It's a big bang project typically that is then launched, and it's launched every 2-3 years within the company. And companies know that it's not sustainable to do it that way, but still in a lot of organizations, that's how the cookie crumbles, let's say, how it actually evolves. So how do we get from that one-off exercise into something which is more sustainable, more recurring? So how can we get from a project around product portfolio management rather into a process of product portfolio management? Getting all that information together to really understand the portfolio from the product dimension as well as the customer dimension is quite data intensive. If we start that exercise within companies, there is significant amount of time, both in time spent, but also throughput time, like how long does it take, lead time from start of data collection to really having all that data well structured and gathered together. That's really a lot of time that is spent. So that is time that is also kind of preventing the exercise from happening regularly or recurringly. So really bringing all of that data quickly together is really a pain in a lot of organizations. Doing it from both dimensions, from product dimension and customer dimension simultaneously, is definitely also one of the challenges. To how do you do that in Excel or in a BI solution? Really going from that product dimension, immediately seeing like what are the customers linked to that, and vice versa. How can you start from a customer segmentation and a customer analysis and see what products are they buying and how does it link to the kind of segmentation of the different products behind. Other challenges are typically around complexity drivers. Are they well understood is that operational data also included? We talked about inventory also as one of the aspects of the supply chain triangle. Well, also when you consider the portfolio analysis, also consider the inventory dimension. We see a lot of organizations being solely focused or only focused on the margin aspect, and then having less emphasis or focus on, for example, the inventory component and the link to working capital requirement. When companies are reviewing the portfolio, we see that they are also not doing it flexibly on a detailed level, but also on an aggregated level of analysis. So how can you integrate the bill of material and not talk only about the end references, the end product references, but also about what are really the different articles and the different product categories or product families, and can we also drive comparisons between these product families and categories, while also talking about individual references and really being able to drive that aggregated versus detailed analysis. The third last one is actually more around how do you not only drive it from good data insights, data analytics, but also about taking action. And we see not only taking action, registering the action, but also implementing the action in reality. I always say we see companies deciding upon 100 things, but actually only implementing 20. So that's a big opportunity for improvement. If from the 100 decisions that companies make, we can implement 80 or 100 instead of only 20, it's when it's really implemented in practice that a difference is being made when we really create added value. We have an inability to integrate it into regular planning meetings. So how do we really facilitate a recurring process? And also how do you link it back to KPIs, which really stimulate and motivate to make and keep on making progress. So that are typically a lot of the challenges or some of the challenges companies face in this domain. Why do we do this? This portfolio management process really has the ability to structurally make a step change in profitability and working capital efficiency. And when you bring it to the EBITDA context, this has really a potential to improve the EBITDA with 1 or 2% overall. So the opportunity or the benefits is really substantial. Next, we want to talk and introduce what our vision is on winning portfolios. And for that winning portfolios, we link back to the supply chain triangle and the thought leadership you might know from Bram. Winning portfolios play on each of these 3 corners of that supply chain triangle. We want to win to ensure that our company, our organization achieves the targeted growth ambitions, so sales ambitions, sales growth. We want to achieve margin ambitions, margin targets. How can we manage profitability to manage the cost well to optimize that margin in line with expectations, and also play on that third angle that also Bram already mentioned. How can we actually free up cash? How can we create a positive cash flow by managing well where our working capital is being utilized in the portfolio? So when we review the portfolio, we really want to review all 3 aspects: growth, sales growth evolution, margin position, margin profitability, and the cash flow dimension. So the optimal, the golden core is really where we have a positive evolution on individual products, on sales, on margin, and on working capital. Quite important question to consider when you come to the constatation that portfolio management is an area for improvement for your organization is to understand how it links back to the organization structure and to the different departments and the different functions within your organization. And there it's quite key to actually have a good understanding of Where is the project sponsor for this? Where is the sponsor of the portfolio management process rather than a project? Who is really advocating for that? And we see that typically residing with what we consider a P&L responsibility. So someone that a function that is responsible for both the top line, the revenue side of things, as well as the bottom line, and that can really steer on, and that is really concerned about the profitability that resides on between that revenue side of things and the bottom line to really steer on that. So that can be in smaller organizations, the CEO sponsoring that, or in larger organizations can be a BU president, really one role which structurally has that P&L responsibility in there. Then the next question is to ask, like, who is the process owner, who is actually facilitating the portfolio management process? And we see in a lot of cases, supply chain understands the challenge around portfolio management well, and is also quite impacted by a poor portfolio management process. So there is an opportunity for supply chain to really facilitate, not to take the portfolio decisions, but really facilitate the process around portfolio management. And then who is actually responsible, and who is responsible for the portfolio as such and for the portfolio decisions. And there is a clear link definitely to a marketing function, where within marketing, strategic marketing as such is responsible for the portfolio that is being operated and positioned into the market space. So we also need to respect them in that responsibility. So when in the ideal case, there is a portfolio management or role within marketing that can think not only operationally, but really tactically and strategically about the portfolio that is being operated. And so supply chain and finance, typically that is a good ally, can be the process owners to actually sit structurally together with someone from marketing in that portfolio management role, and together with the sales stakeholders as a cross-functional process, cross-functional team really around that portfolio management domain. So definitely, just like S&OP as a whole is a cross-functional process, portfolio management for sure is that as well. And as supply chain, we can really play a facilitating role in that grand scheme of decision making. Now, when we understand how we can approach it from an organizational perspective, how do we create actually a view in that portfolio? And how do we drive action in that portfolio? And something which is very well known is the Pareto rule. A lot of our supply chain audience might know the Pareto rule quite well, 18, 15, 5%. Well, this is an example where we actually apply that Pareto rule rather on a contribution margin perspective, rather than a standard product margin perspective. And the contribution margin here reflects also the correct cost of complexity. What is the complexity that we have within our operations domain, and ensuring that that complexity is well translated into a contribution margin. Looking at this example, the first 20% bring us to 125% of the contribution margin, the next 50% to 140% of the contribution margin. And then there is always a tail of, in this case, 30% of the references, where we actually are doing an investment as a company. So we're actually investing absolute contribution margin for sustaining that part in our portfolio. And as supply chain audience, we typically or quickly think in how can we rationalize SKUs, how can we cut the tail, and take initiative there. But portfolio management, and definitely when we deal with that in a broader scheme of things and we work together with sales and marketing stakeholders, portfolio management should be seen as much broader. Portfolio management should also be about how can we actually take actions and initiatives in that 20%? Because if we can actually drive further growth and opportunity in the first 20%, that's where we can really make a tremendous impact in the overall profitability of the company or the overall result for the company. Or how can we create actions to push a piece of the 50% in the back to the head, to actually kind of the 20% at the front. Another way of looking at it is when we link it to the winning portfolios, linking to the three corners of that triangle. And ideally, we have product references where the sales is increasing, where we have a margin which is positively evolving, which is up, and where also our working capital efficiency is quite high. And that there the actions is to nurture that. And similarly, you can do that along those three dimensions to really see like, okay, what are the type of actions that we should take for these different cases where we have declining sales, declining margins, declining efficiency. Definitely the question to be asked there is rather to cure or kill the SKU. So really consider phase out or kind of re-engineering of the SKU and to give it a second lifespan, let's say. So that's really the different type of portfolio actions. So they can go into the direction of price increases, cost downs, how can we drive or further improve efficiency, or how can we drive more volume growth. And it's only then the last option of last resort is the phase out. Really take SKU rationalization as one of the options, but really the option of last resort. There should be so many other possible options and actions to be taken ahead of time. When we talk about that, one of those corners of the triangle, it's around the margin dimension. And then it's really important also for operations, supply chain stakeholders to really deeply understand the profitability. Because for this exercise, the profitability is really key and it's the cornerstone. And we want to really well understand the profitability to compare different products and different customers in the portfolio. It's really that comparison between the products which is important, and therefore the quality of the profitability reporting, the profitability measures is quite important to really well understand. And in order to really understand those profitabilities well, as operations supply chain stakeholders, we really need to understand the profit and loss very well. We need to understand how is that currently structured within our organization, how are costs grouped, and how are costs also allocated. And to go kind of a little bit deeper on that, how are costs grouped is of course like, okay, what is in this example P&L, what is considered under cost of goods sold, what is considered under transport, production result, and efficiency. So we need to understand which costs are located where, but also understanding where are they located. Are they located within the gross margin expression or the net margin expression, or are those costs in overhead costs, which actually only show up on the P&L between the gross margin or the sales margin and the EBITDA. And some costs which are quite material might be hidden there. So we need to understand what are those costs which are actually between the margin position and the EBITDA, and are those costs allocate, if they're in between, they're not typically not allocated to individual products. So how can we do an allocation of those products in the context of portfolio management? That's typically a topic where we get into to really drive a good comparison between different products and different customers. To give that a bit more example, we will talk here about three common problem areas. And the first area where we see a lot of tension around profitability expressions is the changeover costs. And when we talk to a lot of companies, we see that changeover costs are translated to individual products. So they are being allocated, but the way that they're allocated, for example, in the standard product cost is based upon volume, the amount of produced volume or sold volume, or the costs are allocated based upon the machine hours, the hours that the production has run on the machines. And why is that a problem? Well, actually, the larger volume items, which do not create the big changeover complexity, will absorb much more of the changeover costs compared to the low volume items, where the low volume items typically really drive the changeover complexity. They will actually absorb a very tiny amount of the changeover cost. So actually, it creates a very negative situation where the large volume items are actually subsidizing our tail. They're subsidizing our low volume items. So actually, we're providing our organization with information that is faulty, where actually we think we still have a good margin on the low volume items, but actually we are not providing correct information on the profitability of these low volume items. Going in, so a better approach is to allocate those costs based upon production hours and to actually also consider what is the changeover complexity, and doing that in a pragmatic way, not over complexifying it, not making a huge separate project out of it, but actually doing a fair assignment of these costs, a fair allocation of these costs. A second common problem area is around the picking costs. And the picking costs are in a lot of cases allocated based upon the sales volume, while they should be linked to the sales order lines. How many sales order lines did we actually process in order to actually deliver our different customers, linked to the order behavior of the customer. So we actually need to link it back to the picking and warehousing complexity and make sure that those costs are appropriately allocated. And a third typical problem area is around transportation costs, where we see a lot of companies kind of simplifying that logic, making standard logic, which is no longer reflecting the actual transport cost to the customer. So definitely there, it's typically an initiative to ensure that also those transport costs are well linked to individual customers, in this case, based upon the location of shipment and the transport mode. So that, on zooming in, the profitability is quite important for making decisions. And there it's really key to really understand, well, where are we today and how can we, in a pragmatic way, drive cost allocations which are linked to the real complexity drivers. So understanding where are you today, not immediately trying to go to the optimal state, but really understanding, okay, how are we currently dealing with changeover costs, for example, in the standard product calculations or standard product cost calculations. How do we translate that in our projects? We actually talk about net sales margins, but also about complexity margins when it's about a product dimension. And we actually ensure that changeover costs are correctly getting allocated. When we talk about the customer margin, we do include the transport and picking cost to actually get from net sales margin into a customer margin. We only include transport and picking costs on the customer dimension because, of course, the product does not know where it needs to go to. That really is important when we talk about comparing different customers. When we talk about customers, only then transport and picking costs should enter the conversation. So when reviewing the portfolio, we actually also need to kind of create a state where we can actually start the process. And when we start the process or making decisions, it's important to actually define the rules of the game upfront. You create awareness in a portfolio, typically as a first step, and then Afterwards, you need to align as a group across departments on how will we treat this this topic. How will we decide if an SKU is sustainable in our portfolio? Yes or no. How will we decide if a customer is sustainable in our portfolio? Yes or no. And typically there are 3 steps. Step 1 is around that awareness. We create that cross-departmental awareness, cost of complexity, a number of examples there. And we actually link it there as well to the strategic plan. What is the ambition around profitability? What is the ambition around growth? What is the ambition around working capital efficiency? In a second step, we define what we call portfolio guidelines. And that is between the different departments. We align around what are minimum volume thresholds on different levels of aggregation for individual end references, for articles, but also for product categories to be sustainable within our organization. Definitely for the volume thresholds, you want to create a link to changeover complexity and to also production run sizes to actually state, actually, if we want to become efficient in our operations department, we at least need a minimum production volume on an annual basis or a quarterly basis of X, Y, or Z. That's how you actually can define minimum volume thresholds, which you can agree upon between the different stakeholders. The same applies for margin perspective, both in relative margin as well as absolute margin. Where do we want to be longer term on the relative margin, and what is then a minimum relative margin threshold that we need to set for individual products or individual customers, and the same on the absolute margin. What is a minimum absolute margin we should have on an annual basis to ensure that we can keep it sustainably in the portfolio? And in that context, you also want to agree upon what are the rules for new products. How much runway do you give to new products before they will be evaluated compared to those guidelines? Will you actually give them 1 year of time before you will evaluate them compared to the guidelines? Will that be 6 months? Will that be a year and a half? Well, that you need to define upfront. Don't start the discussion when you have a specific SKU ahead in perspective, and then start the discussion around how long can we give it. Really agree upon that. Also agree upon that with your executive team, with your project process sponsor, to actually align on those portfolio guidelines, because they will enforce them as well. Once those portfolio guidelines are agreed upon, that's also the opportunity to translate it into guideline violations. So identify within the portfolio on different time horizons, where are we actually deviating or violating those minimum volume thresholds, and using that to identify areas where improvement is needed. How do we get really from a project perspective more into a process perspective? Well, there is also for that portfolio management process a dimension of getting from what do we do on an annual basis, what do we do quarterly, and what do we do on a monthly basis. Here there is the opportunity, likewise as people do in an executive S&OP, to, for example, do an executive S&OP on a quarterly basis, to actually also do an executive portfolio review with the executive team on a quarterly basis. And there you will actually review the quality of the portfolio, how the portfolio has evolved compared to plan, how the portfolio violations have evolved since last quarter, and as a group across departments drive a root cause analysis. What is actually the reason that we can, what are some of the reasons that we can find to further improve the quality of the portfolio, or to change a declining portfolio health into a more positive trend, and really prepare the actions. And here we want to really drive decisions on the commitment of portfolio actions on a more structural level. So not on individual products and customers, but more on larger initiatives. From that quarterly process, executive portfolio review, there is a need for actually follow-up. There is a need for month-to-month follow-up of the agreed portfolio actions. So tracking the progress, sitting together with the different stakeholders, with the different sales representatives, with the different marketing stakeholders, to actually see, okay, how are we progressing upon the agreed upon actions? Because that's really making the difference between deciding upon 100 things and then implementing 20 things or implementing 80 things. And that needs to happen on a monthly basis. And that's also the link towards the S&OP process, where the S&OP process can really come in very handy to actually use that product management review and the customer product segmentation step in the monthly cadence to actually kind of have a report out of the portfolio management initiative of our process into that overall S&OP process. If you work with an IBP vision, also in that IBP vision, it's quite fundamental that you can install that product management review as one of the recurring process steps. As Solventure, Bram also indicated or referred to that we work on process, people, tools, and analytics. So the tools as such is for us not the primary goal. It's really how can a tool support a good process. So, but in today's world, to manage all of these complexities, you need a good tool. And in that context, we have created this portfolio management platform, a SaaS platform, where we actually integrate a lot of data, where we actually work with a data connector that we, in a lot of cases, link to the ERP system, to SAP in a lot of cases, where we extract a lot of information and really create a data foundation. And what is the role of data in this context of portfolio management? Well, it's actually making things objective. The driving discussions around the portfolio is a very sensitive topic. It's very emotional. You have different stakeholders, different functions around the table. So data helps to objectify the conversation, to really objectify and create a neutral discussion. In that sense, the product is very analytical in nature. When we really look into the functional building blocks of the portfolio management platform, it's around creating awareness in the product and customer portfolio health, slicing and dicing the data in different dimensions to understand what is the current health situation of that product portfolio, of the customer portfolio, and seeing the different metrics and dimensions on commercial profitability, commercial performance, operational performance, and also seeing these complexity drivers at the same time. Once we identify actions or opportunities for improvement, we can register portfolio decisions and portfolio actions, and we can follow them up month over month in regular status meetings around the portfolio. And then the third building block is really around how can we monitor the portfolio and how the portfolio evolves. It's not a static thing. It's really the portfolio is in constant evolution. How does it evolve over time, and how do our KPIs linked to that portfolio evolve? What are some of the key features of our portfolio management platform is a 9-cell overview, which create from commercial performance and operational performance a quick glance on different portfolio subsets. It's always up to date. It's linked to the ERP system. It's interfaced at least on a daily basis or more frequently. So you have real-time insight in that portfolio, and you can analyze that over different time ranges and drill down from that high-level 9-cell perspective deeper into the data to an individual product, to an individual customer, getting back to comparison of different products and so forth. We can collaborate on the portfolio actions. It's something that I personally find quite important, that companies are not bothered with meetings to make progress between different stakeholders, but actually that they are supported in what we call asynchronous communication, asynchronous collaboration on a topic. So here around portfolio actions, we ensure that different stakeholders can collaborate, can leave different analysis or different outputs of different engagements with customers, for example, that they can leave that close to the data. So on the portfolio action, we find all the history back of all the information of previous discussions of last quarter or last year with the same item or the same customer, so that actually all information resides close to where the data resides, is linked to the data actually, and not residing in a separate Excel spreadsheet or in a Trello board where different actions are being captured, but really creating that one book of record around the portfolio. Being able to compare different portfolio subsets, kind of if we have different categories, and in a lot of cases, and one example is when you have branded and private label businesses within the same organization, for sure you want to actually separate those two portfolios into separate portfolio subsets, but then you will want also to compare both of them and set separate targets for that. As a company, you have overall targets, which you then translate to these different portfolio subsets, targets around, again, growth, margin or profitability, as well as working capital efficiency. And definitely for branded versus private label, those targets should be set very differently, because that's different business dynamics, different targets, also linking to the strategy-driven supply chain work we have done, and the thought leadership we have there built up with Bram. That's definitely an area where comparing these portfolio subsets is quite important. And furthermore, you want to track the evolution of the portfolio, both on the violations, but also the overall KPIs. This is an example of that 9-cell, how we make that visual. Typically, it's quite eye-opening and a good way of creating awareness to drive the conversation. We are here looking at a portfolio subset of 250 items, where we see 122 items are in the low segment, and it was only contributing 4% to the absolute net sales margin, whereas in the other end of the spectrum, we have 40 references, 15% of the total references, which bring us already 66% of the net sales margin. And this is actually the case in a lot of portfolios. For sure, if the portfolio is not structurally well managed, this will also be the case in your situation. So really, this is a good way of quickly creating a view on different portfolios and starting the conversation around, okay, how do we actively manage that low segment, and which opportunities do we still find at that high segment? Okay, a lot of material that we have covered. Some takeaways for you is when you start building winning portfolios, these are 4 key requirements to actually think about. Make sure that you make a link to the strategy, make a link to the strategic plan. What is our margin target? What is our overall EBITDA target? What is our working capital target? Make sure that you have that linkage in. Try to agree upon portfolio guidelines between the different stakeholders. Think in process, not in project, to really create that sustainable recurring approach. And also think about what is a good tool to support that, to actually facilitate that, and to facilitate that collaboration between the different functions. We have a white paper specifically on portfolio management. So with this QR code, you will be able to also download that. So happy to share that content with each of you. Actually, we are open for some Q&A. So Bram, I think you have a view on the different questions.
Let me maybe ask you a question in the meantime, Nick. Is we have invested in tooling. How do you think that tooling makes a difference in practice?
I think when we go 10 years back, then we had a lot of companies that were struggling to get to sufficient data and to sufficient data analytics and data insights. But today, we rather have an abundance, so much data. It's rather to have that data well structured and well organized for a specific task at hand. So how can you navigate through that data very efficiently, dedicated to this topic, and then from there do an activation? So it's not only looking and getting insights from data, but how can you do a data activation and actually get to actions? And when you can really, within a solution, within a digital solution, register the actions, initiate the actions, collaborate on the actions, that's where we see a lot of need with actual users within companies. Companies want to really be supported in their process. It's not only about insights. Typically, they have already a number of insights. They don't have it conveniently, but really, how can we support them in an integrated process? That's creating that one book of record, let's say, vision.
Okay, thanks, Nick. There's a question here from Raphael, which is question in general, yeah, how do we go about allocating the cost? I think you explained, but maybe it could help to just clarify with a practical example, like in this case or in that case, that's the type of interaction we have with the controller or with the CFO or with an operations manager to gradually do that.
Kind of, it's really about being pragmatic in that domain. So when we identify a cost component which is not allocated according to the real complexity driver, it's first of all, it's the pragmatic aspect is it sufficiently material? So that's also why we really look at how the P&L is structured, but not only how the P&L is structured, but also how much of the costs are really at which cost category. If it's not material enough, there is no reason to actually bother. But if we are in a certain situation that we find cost components which are material enough, then we go and find for the real complexity driver, what is driving this complexity, and what is a good way of really reallocating and assigning that. So on the example of the, I think, storage cost. So if you take your overall storage cost, okay, how can you really assign the storage cost in a good way to individual kind of products or different product categories? And some products might be frozen products with a totally different storage cost as, for example, the ambient. So for sure, you need to ensure that that allocation happens in a fair and correct way. So average inventory values. So we take monthly snapshots over a period of 1 year, or we can do daily snapshots to really get to average inventory storage value. If you want to assign your storage costs based upon that, that would be a way to even further drive that refinement if that's material.
Okay, and maybe last question then before we close. The webinar is from Louis. Like, what KPI should we give marketing to incentivize this process? So how do we get marketing along? How do we get the CEO or the chief marketing officer along in this process?
Yeah, good question. I think first of all, a good metric is like, what is the margin per active reference, for example? So we often hear about one in, one out. So kind of operations has that rule sometimes applied, like, okay, yes, there is a request for a new launch, so we allow one in as long as there is one out. But you could also think in what is the current situation of margin per active reference. So in an active reference, you should then make a definition of that. Reference that is active in the system, a reference that is sold in the last 12 months. If you can take the baseline of margin per active reference and you can drive further improvement in that, that could be a good way of also creating that incentive with marketing. It will make them also responsible for that profitability dimension and for managing the complexity as well. So as long as they can introduce new products, no problem, but they will also contribute, or they should also contribute to an improvement of that margin per active reference situation.
Okay. Let me also just thank the remaining people on the call, and thank you, Nick, to passionately take us through the topic. And if any of you want to have more information about the solution we have developed, or some of our experiences with customers where we are currently deploying this, obviously don't hesitate to reach out to us. And then we hope to see you back at the next occasion and the next webinar. So thank you.